Today, our topic is the Passover story and its relevance, particularly for today. And the book of the Haggadah, that was something that was composed over a significant period of time by what was known as the Tanaim, the great scholars of that period. It's a book that has been relevant, and it's something that's been used throughout the millennia. Jews all over the world, Jews of all backgrounds, get together, families, friends, etc. And what's crucial is they reenact, they re-experience what happened in Egypt. We're going to use the term Egypt, but we really don't mean Egypt. Egypt is a very, let's say this, it's a very weak third world country that for 4 decades lived off of Soviet foreign aid. The last 5 decades has lived off of American foreign aid, where you have probably 70 to 80% of the population in poverty. The empire that we're speaking about is called Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim is the Hebrew term. We're looking at the northern third of the African continent. We're talking about the Nile River basin, the whole extended Nile River going as far deep into what was known at that time as Black Africa, Kush it was called. It goes, Mitzrayim is from the tip of Africa, the northern tip, all the way down to Black Africa, which is today's Eritrea, today's Kenya, Uganda. And the area of Mitzrayim encompassed today's Egypt, today's Libya, Sudan, that whole northern third of the African continent. It was the empire of its time. And what does that mean? It was the empire of its time. It was the dominant economy, and technologically and militarily, it was the dominant empire of its time. And before we start the story, let's just define those terms. Mitzrayim, because it had the Nile River basin, was always a great economy. Agriculturally, it was a great economy, whether it was wheat, whether it was cotton, whatever the various crops that were produced, not only used internally, but exported throughout the world. But when Joseph came to Egypt, and then the whole story of the famine, what did Joseph do? Joseph the Jew, who ended up becoming the Ben Bernanke, the Robert Reuben of Mitzrayim, he was the second most powerful man on earth, just below the Pharaoh. And the Pharaoh depended upon him. And the Pharaoh literally gave him the keys, handed him the keys of that economy. What Joseph did was he prevented a black market. In a time of famine, people hoard and they gouge prices. He prevented any of that from happening. Just to give a modern analogy, look at Cuba. The black market economy of Cuba is more powerful than the real economy. That's true in many parts of Russia today and in many countries, in Venezuela, etc. He didn't allow for that. He kept prices low, and he made the basic essentials, food, something that would be accessible to everyone. And he did something incredibly moral and incredibly ethical that he insisted the Pharaoh agree to. And that is other countries that were also suffering from the famine. And those countries that would have died, would literally have died of the famine. He provided sustenance to those countries. And by doing that, what he enabled was that the world would survive this horrific famine, as well by selling the food, whether it was to the people of Mitzrayim, the great Egyptian empire, or whether it was to other countries. What he did was bring the world's wealth to Mitzrayim, to Egypt. And with that wealth, they became an incredibly dominant empire, a dominant economy, and he enabled them to ultimately shape the world. Now, while that's happening, a parallel track is that until that time, historically, what were the implements of war? How was war fought? You had bows and arrows. You had shields. You had spears. You had knives. Egypt developed a technology known as the chariot. The chariot, which would be attached to horses, changed all of warfare. And it made Egypt a very, very dominant empire. The combination of those two phenomena made Egypt, and there's very, very few times in all of human history where one empire dominated the globe. That was the case with Mitzrayim. Just to give you an example, Think about today. When studies have been done on technology, the impact of technology on the world, the most significant technology that changed the world was Gutenberg with the movable type, where ultimately the ability to create printing presses, it changed all of the world. The second most significant technological impact, at least the way historians look at it, is the World Wide Web. What was the World Wide Web? It was a domestic technology. Until that time, it was something that was secret. It was something that was a vehicle of communication done amongst Americans in the military. It's how they communicated, where no one else would have access to their communication. Once they let that technology out, it changed how the world does business. It changed how the world communicates, how the world socializes. It changed everything. Another example that is GPS, was a military technology with a domestic application. Going back to Mitzrayim, that incredible technology known as the chariot had a domestic application called the wagon. With the wagon, transportation changed. The whole ability to transport goods, which until that time had been done on donkey back, on camel back, horseback. Now, with the concept of the wagon, it enabled the whole transportation system in terms of goods, etc., to change. And all of that was controlled by Mitzrayim, controlled by Egypt, which is why when Joseph notifies his family that he's alive, the Pharaoh has to sign off. He has to sign off on the notion of wagons going to transport the family down to Egypt, because that kind of precious technology is not something they wanted out of the empire. So with that backdrop, when the family of Joseph, meaning the Jewish family that at that time was all of 70 people, are invited to come and live in Egypt, and the issue initially is that Jacob wanted to visit his son. He knew that the Pharaoh wouldn't allow his son to leave Egypt because his son was the one controlling the whole economy, managing the whole situation of the famine. So the goal initially was that they would come and visit Joseph. God comes to Jacob. They're in an oasis that till this day exists. It's the city of Beersheba. At that time, Beersheba was an oasis in the Negev desert in which international travelers would stop, would water their animals, themselves get water on the way into Africa. God comes to him. He says, this is not going to be a temporary visit, but Jewish history is going to play itself out. And in fact, this was the one time in 4,000 years, it's the one time you didn't have Jews living in Israel. For this 210-year period, when the Jews will go down, plant themselves temporarily, but live in Egypt. Now, in the 210 years that they lived there, not all of those years were enslavement. It was only the last 86 years. The first number of decades were very, very positive. The Jews came to Mitzrayim, they come to Egypt. Joseph is afraid of assimilation. And what does he do? Even though he himself is an incredible Renaissance man, he establishes the first ghetto in the history of Jewish history. The ghetto where the Jews live in Ramses, where the community starts to grow, to flourish, and they go from being a family into a people, into a nation. Even though in antiquities there's a very high incidence of child mortality, the Jews had very little child mortality. The Jewish women had multiple births, meaning you had the notion of twins, of triplets, even cases of sextuplets, and the Jewish community explodes. There's a huge, huge growth rate of these Jews. It says, "Vatimale ha'aretz osam." Literally, Mitzrayim becomes filled with them. They've left the ghetto. They now have taken over many, many industries. They're involved in many trades. And they're having an incredibly successful experience there. They're very, very loyal citizens. They improve the economy even more. But they begin to have such an impact on the economy that they take over many dimensions of culture, of trade, of industry, of the economy. And they become a threat. They become a very, very significant threat to the empire. Now, if we can take a step back for a second, there are two types of anti-Semitism that exist in history. One is what we'll call grassroots anti-Semitism. An example of grassroots would be the anti-Semitism that exists in Poland. You had a situation where the Polish Catholics, it was a religious Catholic country, and every Sunday in church, as Poles across the country would attend their local churches, they heard very, very harsh, very negative, very anti-Semitic diatribes against the Jews. Just to give you one example. In the Gospels, there are 4 accounts of the crucifixion. 2 accounts clearly blame the crucifixion on the Romans. One account is a combination of Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor of Judea, with the help of certain Jews. There's one account of the 4 that primarily blames the Jews. In Poland, as was the case in Ukraine, as was the case in many parts of Europe, the other 3 accounts of the crucifixion are not taught, are not utilized. It's only that one account of the 4 that blames the Jews that is taught. And the Jews are accused of the worst crime in history, the crime of deicide, the crime of killing the carpenter of Nazareth, of killing the Lord and Savior of the Christian world. And you can imagine that engenders incredible, incredible anti-Semitism. But that's grassroots. That's where it's coming from the grassroots up. There's a second kind of anti-Semitism. It's the anti-Semitism you saw in Venezuela, where it was generated, it was top-down, known as grass tops. It came from Chavez. Iran today has grass tops anti-Semitism. It's not coming from the population. It's not coming from the Yazidis, the Kurds, the various minorities. It's coming from the government. It's coming from the imams on the top, the Supreme Ayatollah, the IRGC. That's a very different type of anti-Semitism. That was the anti-Semitism in Mitzrayim, what the Haggadah teaches us. The text, and we'll talk about why that text was used, that the rabbis chose, was the famous text from the end of Deuteronomy, the story that the Jewish farmer tells when the Jewish farmer would bring his first fruits to Jerusalem, to the temple, declare his expression of gratitude. His gratitude not only for the crop being successful, but for all of Jewish history, for the fact that God liberated and emancipated the Jews from enslavement, from torture, from cruel, vindictive punishment, turned the people into a nation that became literate, that became sophisticated, that became a free nation, and ultimately was able to settle a land where God, under the leadership first of Moshe through the desert, then Joshua, brought the Jewish people into the land of Israel, returning them to their ancestral homeland, where they became an autonomous nation, a nation of thoughtful, intellectual people, of thoughtful, moral people, ethical people, of thoughtful, philosophical, theological people that would create a society that would impact the world. Ultimately, that manifests itself in the times of King David, of King Solomon, where the Jewish nation impacted intellectually, spiritually, morally, literally the civilized world. And again, the Jewish farmer articulates that gratitude, where he doesn't just thank God for a good crop, for a good financial year, but he thanks God for every step of the way in all of Jewish history. And we'll explain why was that text chosen as the text of which we analyze Seder night. So in that text, what it says is the following. After describing how the Jews went to Egypt, why they went to Egypt to settle there, the great, we'll call it geometric, almost exponential growth from a family into a nation, and then the beginning of the anti-Semitism. And if I could use the analogy, in an automobile, you don't go from 0 to 70 in 1 second. There's a gradual development of speed, of power. In history, it's the same way. Things don't change overnight. There's a transition. There's a fertile soil of anti-Semitism that is created, of treating the Jew as the other, is treating the Jew as a threat. And that is what the government did. What does the Haggadah say? What does the text say? Vayareu lanu hamitzrim. The Egyptians turned us into something evil. It doesn't say they were bad to us initially. It says that they turned us into an other. They turned us into a threat. They portrayed us as a cancer that had metastasized and was a threat to the viability of the empire. How did the government do that? And I'm going to use a term in English: state-sponsored anti-Semitism. Grasstops or state-sponsored anti-Semitism. What the Pharaoh, and it's driven by the Pharaoh, says to the nation, he starts perpetrating that we are a fifth column. What's the term of fifth column? It's a term I'm borrowing from the infamous Generalissimo Francisco Franco. Franco in Spain described the fifth column that was a threat from within. What the Pharaoh said, and it was the fear, it was the anxiety of any Mitzri, with the rich natural resources they had, with the incredible amounts of gold, of silver, the wealth that they had. The fear is that from Mesopotamia, from the northern border, an enemy could come in and threaten them. And that's why they had a huge military presence on their northern border to prevent that from happening. But what he said is, V'nosaf gam hu al salneinu, that the Jewish minority would join up with the external enemy, would be a fifth column, an enemy from within that had spread throughout the land, and that would fight from within as the enemies would come from without, and would drive us off of our own nation. And that was the great fear. So he portrayed and he conveyed that the Jews were an enemy from within. In this period of state-sponsored anti-Semitism, of portraying the Jew as a threat, as an other, because after all, the Jews in Egypt spoke a different language. They spoke Hebrew. The Jews dressed differently, a much more modest form of dress than the Mitzri. The Mitzri women, dressed very, very scantily. They exposed their torsos, they exposed their bosoms, it was a very lewd society. It was a society where whether one was married or not married, monogamy was not something that was very popular. Amongst the Jews, it was the rule. The Jews dressed differently, spoke a different language, had different names, and that was an incredible, incredible threat. I'll use an analogy. When Poland, which did not exist for 150 years, think about the great Habsburg dynasty, which conquered Galicia, southern Poland. The Tsarist Russia, first under Peter, then under Katerina. They conquered most of northern Poland, northeastern, central Poland, and the Prussians conquered northwestern Poland. So Poland didn't exist. It was literally conquered either by Tsarist Russia, by the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Habsburg dynasty, or by the Prussia. When Polish nationalism manifested itself, and ultimately Poland was reconstituted as a nation after World War I, after 1918, they did a study. Here they had this Jewish minority of 3.5 million people, 12% of their population. They found out that the Jews were 37% of the city of Lodz, 27% of the city of Krakow, 33% of the city of Warsaw. But the Jews controlled certain trades, certain industries. And they were very, very concerned about this nation that, for the most part, dressed differently. 87% of all Jews, the language they spoke and communicated in was Yiddish. 6%, the language they spoke and communicated in was Hebrew. You had these schools, these hachshara schools, preparatory schools that were preparing Jews to travel to Palestine, to return to their ancestral homeland. Only 7% of all Jews in Poland, their first language, the language they communicated in, was Polish. So they were a great threat to the Polish Catholics. This state-sponsored anti-Semitism was literally something that Hitler, that the Third Reich, took. They didn't necessarily become experts in the Haggadah. They were not necessarily biblical scholars. But intuitively, they did the same thing. When Hitler came to power in 1933, he appointed Joseph Goebbels. Goebbels became the Minister of Propaganda. And Goebbels took as his partner a man, Dr. Julius Streicher. What did Goebbels and Streicher do? From 33 on, they changed the textbooks in all of the German schools. They fired teachers who were not Nazi teachers. They replaced them with Nazi teachers. And they started brainwashing a generation. How about the adults? Well, Streicher created something called the Stürmer, the stormtrooper. What was the Stürmer? It was a free newspaper that was distributed throughout the towns, villages, and cities of Germany. It became the most popular newspaper for a very simple reason. It was free when every other newspaper cost money. Think about in Israel, Yisrael Hayom. Why would you buy Ma'ariv or Yediot Achronot when you can get Yisrael Hayom for free? It has everything the other newspapers has, and it costs you nothing. That's what the Stürmer was. They took, and Yad Vashem had a very famous exhibit on this before COVID. They took the great directors, producers of Germany, and had them producing propaganda films. In the 1930s, how did an adult see the news? There were no televisions. You went to the movie theater. If you were an American, you had movie tone news. Between the double feature, there was always a double feature, you would watch movie tone news. Well, in Germany, they did the same thing. And what they did was they had propaganda films. That was the news. They had these pseudo-scientific experiments, and they would show a Jew is not like an Aryan. An Aryan has a straight, fine spine. A Jew has what's called in German a bugel, a hunchback. A Jew has the hooked nose. An Aryan has a straight, proper nose. A Jew has the pot gut. An Aryan doesn't have a pot gut. And they would show rats and Jews. Look at the nose of a rat. Look at the Jew. Look at the nose of a Jew. Look at the belly of a rat. Look at the belly of a Jew. And they would say that Jews are not human. They're these predatorial, pseudo-human. You don't want to have Jewish blood in Aryan blood. A member of the SS had to prove his Aryan nature, had to go back 3-4 generations with church records. A Jew would poison your blood. What was called a Mischling, and ultimately a few years down the road, in 1935, with the Nuremberg laws, they outlawed anyone having relations with a Jew, marrying a Jew, because after all, you don't want to poison the true Aryan bloodline. So these pseudo-scientific examples of how they would brainwash the population, which was not limited just to school children, but applied to the adults as well. This is exactly what went on for decades in Mitzrayim. Phase 2 was not slavery. Phase 2, Vaye'anunu, the Haggadah teaches us. What's Vaye'anunu? They afflicted us. What's known as the labor tax. In today, think about ourselves. We pay many taxes, but every one of the taxes we pay is a financial tax. Example, capital gains taxes, income taxes, property taxes, the death tax, inheritance tax. They're all financial taxes. In antiquities, you had a phenomenon known as the labor tax. For 3 weeks, for 4 weeks every year, men had to leave their family, leave their wives and children, had to leave their business, leave their craft or profession, and go. Some men were sent to build Pitzon and Ramses, what we'll call the Kansas City. were the silos, the great granaries and storage houses for grain work. They had public works projects. Some men were sent to build dams on the Nile River so the river wouldn't overflood and destroy communities. So you had these public works projects. Some were building sewers, building highways, building roads. Now, the government said the following: look at these Jews. They would have starved to death. They came here. We fed them. We enabled them to live here. And what did they do? Like leeches, like parasites. They took over this industry, right? Imagine the Jews went to Hollywood and they took over the film business. The Jews went into the financial banking business and investment banking business, Goldman Sachs, and they took over Shearson Lehman. They took over Wall Street. The Jews went into law. They weren't allowed into the white Jew law firms. They created their own law firms, Garden Apps, Proskauer, many other law firms. And they took over the legal industry. They went into academia. They went into education. They went into medicine, and they took over all of these industries. You and I know that's not exactly correct, but it plays well. You have Jews who are in this administration and a Republican administration, Greenblatt and Kushner, and then in the Democratic administration, Blinken, and who's the head of the Homeland Security. You had all these Jews. You had Jews on the Supreme Court, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, et cetera, et cetera. And they're taking over everything. And that is what was done in Germany. And that's what was done in Mitzrayim, in Egypt. The state-sponsored anti-Semitism. So phase 2 was, these Jews should show some gratitude. Instead of them doing what they're doing, let them do the labor tax. Let them build the dams. Let them build the sewers. Let them build the highways. Let them build the granaries and the storage cities. Now, what Egyptian, what Mitzri is going to say, no, I want to leave my family 3-4 weeks. No, I want to endanger my profession because I'm not going to be there on the farm, or I'm not going to be there in the business. No, you're kidding. They wanted to stay home. Think about how hot it was. Think about what slave labor was, what labor was like in the heat of Mitzrayim. There's no air conditioning in antiquities. And they were very happy not to have to do that. So now you have this dichotomy. Jews do labor, Mitzrayim don't do the labor tax. Jews are forced to do the labor tax, Mitzrayim are not. Once you have that dichotomy, then the next step is enslavement. And again, they were there 210 years. It was the last 86 years in which they were enslaved. And the Jews were enslaved. And to a great degree, I'm not saying this was the only enslavement, but to a great degree, a lot of the enslavement was not done for an economic benefit. It wasn't done for just an economic benefit. And I'll give you an example. When it says that Vayitnu aleinu avodah kasha, they imposed upon us literally hard labor. So the Haggadah analyzes that. What does that mean? So it says, Vayavidu b'nei Yisrael b'farach. When the government imposed slavery, it was b'farach. That's a very tough word to translate. What is b'farach? So we know there's a term. It's used by the great medieval scholars. It's used in Hebrew. The term is a pircha. What's a pircha? When you're studying, you have a question. That's a she'elah, a question. You're asking a factual question. You're asking for clarity. A pircha is a different kind of question. It's where I undermine the very assumption. You're making a case legally or philosophically, and you're making it based upon certain premises, assumptions. A pircha is where I try to undermine the very assumption that you're working with. That I question your assumptions. I question your foundations. So what was happening? The Medrash spells out. The government of Mitzrayim imposed upon Jewish women back-breaking work. These were 80, 90-pound women. To give them back-breaking work had no economic benefit. They would produce nothing. It would just break their psyche. And it says they they imposed upon men the job of being seamstresses and tailors. Now, if you come from Sicily, you come from the Amalfi Coast. Being a tailor is an incredible, incredible talent and profession. Think about the tailors that produce ketone or Isaiah or Brioni. These are the world's best tailors. In antiquities, women were seamstresses and tailors. It was not a male profession. The men had not developed that fine motor coordination, that fine dexterity required to be a top-notch seamstress. So they're sitting there, poking themselves, bleeding by the fingers because they don't know how to do that work. What was the purpose? What was the point? The point was to break the self-worth, to break the psyche, because both the men and women who were enslaved produced nothing. Their lives produced nothing. And I'll use an analogy. Those of you from Michigan, there was a Jew by the name of Moshe Flat. He was a former Amshinover Hasidim, grew up in Poland. His family grew up. They were Amshinover Hasidim. And for his 16th birthday, he was given by the SS an all expenses paid education in Birkenau, in Auschwitz-Birkenau University. And he described, what did he do the first 3 weeks in Birkenau? As many of you have been to Birkenau, you know. They cleared out a whole area, huge, massive area, and they built barracks, rows and rows, countless rows of barracks for slave laborers. The average life expectancy, they worked people to death in Birkenau, was 10 weeks. So while this construction is going on, you can imagine there are rocks, stones, there's tree stumps, all kinds of things that have just accumulated for them to clear out this area. And the SS tells them to take this, call it refuse, this construction material that's left over, and to take it to the far, far end of this massive camp. And it's backbreaking work. And they're getting fed, 600, 500 calories a day, and they're losing pounds by the day doing this. And after 3-4 weeks, when this whole slave labor team of Jews have cleared this out, the SS says, "Wunderbar, Juden. Good job. Now take this garbage that you've moved and bring it back to the far end of the camp where it came from." And he described how these slave laborers, these Jewish slaves in Auschwitz-Birkenau, literally, they dropped like flies. They died during bringing it back. Why? Because they lost all will to exist. If your whole life is purposeless, if the slave labor you're doing has no benefit, has no purpose, you have no sense of self-worth, you have no sense of self-respect, you give up hope. You give up the will to fight, to continue to go on. And that was part of the goal of the enslavement of the Jews, was to break their psyche. And it had that impact. The birth rate of the Jews went way, way down. The malaise of the Jews, the depression that set in amongst the Jews. And think about it, libido, the sexual drive, is impacted by depression. It's inhibited by depression. And it came to such a point where the Egyptians, it was a short period of time, it was decreed by the Pharaoh, they decreed death for all Jewish baby boys. They would allow the Jewish girls to continue. They would take them, raise them, use them as sexual objects. The baby boys, though, would be killed. It was not a long period of time, but it was a period of time. And many Jews, Moses' famous parents, his mother Yocheved, his father Amram, who were leaders of the Jewish community, he didn't have sophisticated means of birth control. They separated from each other because the only guaranteed form of abstinence is separation. And Jewish couples stopped bringing children into the world. You had that during the Holocaust. Why would you bring a child into the world to have that child slaughtered? Why would you bring a child into the world to see that child die, be killed? And the Jewish birth rate shrinks even further. Amram and Yocheved have a daughter. The oldest child, her name is Miriam. And she says to her father, she makes the case that, Father, what you're doing is worse than the Pharaoh. Because as long as the Jews have hope, as long as the Jews will feel that there's a better tomorrow, that the winds of change will come, that ultimately the Almighty God will help the Jews, will enable the Jews to have a better future in tomorrow. If we have a Jewish people that still exists, there's a Jewish people to redeem, there's a Jewish people to liberate. But if you prevent the Jews from ever coming back, from ever being produced, from being born, there's no Jewish people to save or liberate. She made the case to her parents. Her father and mother, who were leaders, her mother, for those who remember, was the head of what we call the OBGYN union. They didn't have OBGYNs in antiquities. They had what was known as a midwife. And it was those very midwives, which she was the head of, that defied the Pharaoh and would not actively be involved in the killing on the birth stool and the killing of Jewish children. And the two of them decided publicly to remarry, to come back together, and to encourage others to come back together. That really was the beginning of the turn. When Jews believed they would have a better future and a better tomorrow, and when they started to procreate, to reproduce the Jewish people, that was the beginning of the future. They have a child. That child, his name was Avigdor. That's what they named him. We don't call him Avigdor. That's his Hebrew name. We refer to him as Moses. Why do we call him Moses? Because, as many of you know, during the decree of the death of these children, they put this child in a basket. We don't know that it was necessarily the Nile, but in some body of water. They put him in a basket, and the older sister watched from afar. The Egyptian royal princess is going to bathe, and she sees a crying baby in a basket. And she defies her own father's decree. This Egyptian royal princess, we don't know what her Egyptian name was. We call her Bitya. Many Jews today have the name Batya. It's a common name for Jewish women. It's named after this woman. What's Bitya or Batya? The daughter of God. We don't call her Pharaoh's daughter. We call her literally because of her defiance of this horrific, immoral lifestyle of her father. And think about it. The most powerful man on earth, no one dares defy his decree. But the one person who he has no power over is his adolescent daughter. I mean, it's fascinating. And he has a soft spot for his adolescent daughter, and he doesn't insist on her killing this child, and she raises this child. She becomes the surrogate mother, the stepmother for this child, the foster mother for this child. And this child is raised in the Egyptian royal court. And he's called in Arabic, Musa, in Hebrew, Moshe, in English, Moses. Why do we call him that? What's Moshe? I have literally taken him out of the river. I've saved this child, liberated this child by taking him out of the river, raising him as my own. And is our gratitude to this righteous Gentile. We call him that. He's raised. He becomes a government official. He's exceedingly bright, exceedingly talented, and exceedingly humble. And the Pharaoh has a liking for him. And he knows full well that if he manifests himself as too philo-Semitic, as too pro-Jewish, it's not going to work. So what does he do? He comes up with an economic ruse. He says, look, at this point, decades and decades into slavery, the fuel that runs this economy, the fuel that runs the Egyptian economy, is slave labor. There's a law in economics of diminishing returns. If we work these people 7 days a week, 4 weeks a month, 12 months a year, It's just not going to work in terms of their productivity. Let's try an economic experiment. Let's try to give them 1 day off a week. I bet you, and we can give it a 6-month trial, I bet you they'll produce a lot more 6 days a week than they do in 7. And the benefit economically to the empire will be far, far more significant. And sure enough, that happens. Now, that was the economic ruse. What was his goal? On that day off, not all Jews were enslaved. The tribe of Levi, what we call the Levian, that's where the name Levi Strauss comes from, right? The tribe of Levi or Levi. They would educate. They would inspire. The famous Psalm 92 is something that was said long before King David, was said in Egypt, sung in Egypt by the Jewish slave laborers on their day off. And it enabled the Jews to weather this very difficult time in Jewish history and to prepare and yearn for a better future. We all know the story that here the Prince of Egypt, Moses, the Prince of Egypt, leaves the royal palace, goes into the slums, goes into the Jewish slums, and he sees a situation where an Egyptian government official who had the hots for a Jewish woman sends off her husband on a work detail. It's at night. There's no electricity. There's no electric lights. He comes into her tent. She assumes it's her husband. And his goal was to violate this Jewish woman. The husband comes back from the work detail, finds this man in bed with her. He realizes he's been exposed. And what does he do? He starts beating the husband to death. After he beats the husband to death, he'll beat the wife to death. In the midst of this, Moses sees this. And Moses cannot tolerate. It says, Vayifen ko vako. Moses realizes if I stay incognito, if I stay clandestine, if I stay in the recesses of the darkness, what will happen is no one will know I was here. And we can live for a better tomorrow. Who knows? Maybe Moses will become a very significant player in the government. Maybe he'll become one of the next pharaohs. Who knows? But he can't tolerate, even though he knows it'll be the end of who he is and all of his attempts to help the Jews. He can't let this innocent Jew be beaten to death. He cannot allow this man and woman to be killed. And he comes in and he stops the taskmaster, the Egyptian official, and he kills the Egyptian official. And word gets out. Unfortunately, he was actually ratted out by 2 very, very bad Jewish men, Datan and Abiram. And now he's public enemy number 1. You know, we have this phrase, you can take the boy out of Brooklyn, you can't take Brooklyn out of the boy. You know, you go to California, nobody's allowed to honk their horn. And all of a sudden you got this guy who's smashing away at the horn, you know, who's screaming and yelling, driving like a New Yorker. You know, the guy's been 20 years in Beverly Hills. You can take the boy out of Brooklyn, you can't take Brooklyn out of the boy. That was the case. You can take the Jew, right? Moses, you can take the Jew out of the Jewish community, but you can't take the Jew out of the man. And of course, he flees. He's publicly enemy number 1. Where are you going to go? You can either go north to Mesopotamia, or you can go south into Black Africa, into Kush. And that's where he goes. And as a fugitive, the people in Kush realize this is the former Egyptian prince, the Prince of Egypt. They bring him in. And then for decades, he plays a role in public works projects, in building the economy, in building the government, in building a society that's a much more sophisticated, much more beneficial to its population, a society in Black Africa. And he plays a major role there. And after he retires, after many decades in public service, he moves to Saudi Arabia, where he settles there. And he's discovered, we know the famous story of the well, where he protects these women who are the children of a famous cattle baron, a famous sheep herder by the name of Jethro. And Jethro wants this man as a son-in-law. He ends up becoming his son-in-law. Joe Lieberman, Senator Lieberman, just died. The joke, his wife Hadassah said that after all those years as being the Attorney General of the state of Connecticut, and 24 years as United States Senator representing the state of Connecticut, he got a position at Cassavitz. Cassavitz was a law firm that David Friedman was a partner. He becomes a partner there, a man in his 70s. She joked, it's the first time in his life my husband's earning a decent living. Well, Moses, after all those years in public service, now goes into the private sector. His father-in-law appoints him as the CEO of this major sheep herding and cattle business. He has thousands of employees, etc. And as he is the leader of this company, he has an encounter with God, the famous encounter of the burning bush. And he had given up on the Jewish people. He risked his life for the Jewish people. Achein noda hadavar. Surely the matter is known. And he said, how can this be? I risked my life for these people. Then they rat me out. Well, what happened was he gave up on them decades ago. And God convinces him not to give up on them. Why is the imagery of God appearing to him tumbleweed on fire? And what was the particular image? The periphery was on fire. I apologize. What I said is just the opposite. The vacuum, the center, where there was nothing to burn, there was no fuel to burn, which defies the laws of physics, is on fire. But the periphery, where there's at least fuel, there's this tumbleweed, this periphery that could be consumed by the fire, it's not consumed. The fire stays inside the center, inside the heart of the tumbleweed. And Moses is confused by this. It defies the laws of physics. And that image is to say the following. What are the Jews on externally? They're illiterate pagan slaves. They're wretched slaves who ratted you out for only risking your life to save them. But that's all you see. You only see the superficial exterior. The message is that beneath that superficial, cold, wretched exterior, there's still a fire. That fire has not been snuffed out. The Jews are still warm. And you, Moshe, with your sensitivity, with your incredible intellect, your incredible kindness, caring, your ability to care for each and every individual, you can bring that fire that has not been snuffed out. You can bring it to the surface. You can transform these people. You can educate them. You can educate them to lead an ethical, moral life. Educate them to have a covenant with me, a covenant of moral, ethical perfection, a covenant of theological, of intellectual, philosophical perfection. And you can create a society that will go on to ultimately transform the destiny of humanity. An ethical society, a moral society. You'll bring them to Israel. You'll bring them back to their native land. And through that perfected society, they will change the world. But I need someone who can be an educator. Moshe pushed back. He didn't want to do it. I'm not Michael Oren. I'm not Abba Eben. I'm not an orator. God says, I'm not looking for an orator. I'm looking for a mentor. I'm looking for an educator. I'm looking for someone who cares. Someone who can mentor and nurture and develop a people that has been downtrodden, that has no self-respect, to give them self-worth, to give them self-respect, and turn them into the people of the book. And that's Moses' goal. And there's a whole dialogue where Moses does not want to take on that mission, but ultimately God convinces him. And he goes back. And with unfortunately, initial failures, he and his brother Aaron ultimately win over the Egyptian people. And they break the will of the government that refuses, that insists upon keeping them as slaves. And there's a process. It takes over a year of time. The process that we know of the 10 plagues. What are the 10 plagues? The first plagues of blood, And the question is, what was the second plague? Was it frogs or was it crocodiles? It's a debate amongst the great medieval scholars. The term is Tzfardeia. What is Tzfardeia? We know that they came out of the Nile River. Was it crocodiles or was it frogs? Whatever it was, the point is that the Egyptians worshipped the Nile. The Nile was their source of blessing. It was their economic power. It was a source because remember, all the great cities and all the great communities of Egypt all were built along the Nile River basin. And here, this source of life and this source of strength that they worshipped became a source of death. The blood killing off the fish, the blood preventing them from having drinking water, the frogs or the crocodiles that came out of the Nile being a source of a curse and vexation. That was the first. After that, the various plagues go from being a nuisance, breaking down everything that they worshipped, to the defeat, destruction, and breakdown of every component of the Egyptian economy. What was the Egyptian economy? Think about antiquities. It was primarily an agricultural economy. And that economy is broken. Think about what's called Dever. Dever is the fifth plague. It's the Ebola virus or the COVID virus that affects the animals and not the people. Why the animals? Because when you look, it specifically spells out the horses, the donkeys, the camels, the cattle, the oxen, the bulls. When you destroy the bulls, you've destroyed all the John Deere tractors and all the field implements for plowing. When you destroy the camels, you no longer have a vehicle of long-term transportation. When you destroy the donkeys, you've just destroyed the short-term and the mid-range transportation. When you destroy horses, you've now just destroyed the vehicle that carries the chariots. And the majority of the large animals were wiped out. And that's not something you can bounce back from. Because what kind of animals we're talking about? 3, 4, 5, 6-year-old animals. Not yearlings, not calves. It takes years to come back from that. It had a huge impact on the economy. So here the Egyptians didn't want to let go of their slave labor because they said that's the fuel that generates the economy. Every dimension of the economy was destroyed. The hail destroyed certain crops. The locust destroyed the other crops. So that sector of the economy, the actual agricultural benefit, the crops, the produce, is wiped out. And this huge economy that defines the world, that shapes the world, Egypt, let's not kid ourselves. That's Wimbledon's center court. That's Arthur Ashe Stadium of the US Open. There are many, many games going on. There are many, many courts and matches taking place. But Serena, Rafael, they only play on center court. They play in Arthur Ashe Stadium. They only play on Wimbledon center court. That's what Mitzrayim was to all of the countries, to all of the various nations that existed in antiquity. And step by step, that economy was being broken, destroyed, and undermined through the various plagues. The knockout punch, the final plague, and this was the plague that God had Moses warn the government from day one, was the death of the firstborn. Why was the plague the death of the firstborn? Why did that have to be the vehicle? You could have had the disease during the fifth plague of Dever affect the people the way it affected the animals. So why did God wait? And that's very crucial. The Egyptian society or civilization was rooted in something known as primogeniture. What's primogeniture? It's the way, to use an analogy, that America was created. We are a nation that was produced as a function of primogeniture. I'll give you an example. Take a city like Rochester, Troy, Utica, Albany. These are not biblical names. I understand why there's a Bethlehem in every state. I understand why there's a Hebron, a Jerusalem in every state. Because America was settled by Puritans, by religious Christians, and they wanted to have biblical names for their communities. But that's not Albany, that's not Schenectady, that's not Utica, that's not Rochester, that's not Troy. But yet, if you look at New York State, if you look at Pennsylvania, if you look at Ohio, if you look at Michigan, if you look at Illinois, every one of those states has cities with those names. How did that happen? And if I could ask the question differently, how was America settled? Primogeniture. What's primogeniture? It's the firstborn. It's the bechor. I'm using the term in Hebrew, the bechor. Because the parents would give the farm to the oldest child, and they would say to the other children, go west, my child, go west, my child. The business, the blacksmith business, the farm was given to the oldest children. The younger children, we say in Yiddish, like a Teutenbankes, you know, like a leech trying to get blood out of a dead body. It's not going to happen. So they would have to go west, and they would settle virgin territory. And they would come to new territory, virgin territory, and they would name it after their nativity. They would name it after the community they came from. That's how America was settled. That's how America was built. That's exactly was Mitzrayim. All of the government monopolies. Don't think simplistically that the Pharaoh controlled 1/3 of the African continent. That's not how the country was run. That's not how the empire was run. It was run how? Primogeniture. The father would get a government monopoly and become a very wealthy man, and he would pass that on to his firstborn son, and the rest of the children would have to go on their own. That's primogeniture. They were the power base. They were the control. They're the ones who ran, whether it's the military, whether it's different sectors of the economy, different sectors of industry, of culture. It was all primogeniture. They're the ones who Moshe, representing God, said, liberate, create an ethical society, create a moral society, and liberate the Jews. And the goal was not initially for the Jews to leave. Down the road, the Jews would go to Israel. They'd have a great NAFTA, a free trade agreement with Mitzrayim, with Egypt, and they would share. But the goal was for the Jews to be liberated from slavery, to go out to the desert, to have a rendezvous, a whole seminar, an experience with God, and come back as Jewish Egyptians, come back and play the role that they played under Joseph, to influence the great civilization, morally, ethically. And then the next month they would go for another encounter with God and come back. And as Jewish Egyptians, they would influence the great economy, the great civilization, which would have a ripple effect. If you could transform Egypt from an immoral, from a polytheistic society into an ethical, into an intellectual, into a monotheistic society, rooted in ethics and morals, you could impact the whole world. That was the goal. But the primogeniture, meaning the government, the leadership, the people who controlled all of the businesses, the monopolies, they weren't going to let that happen. And they squelched the Jews. And they prevented it. And even though many in the population said, enough, dayenu, let the Jews have the ability to live like everyone else, the government wouldn't allow it. The power base wouldn't allow it. And in the end, it's that very power base that died. It wasn't the Egyptians who died. It was the firstborn. It was the power base that was defeated, destroyed, and undermined. And then at that point, you can bend until you break. And at that point, the Pharaoh was broken. And he said, just go, just leave. And we all know the story. They pushed the Jews out to such a degree the Jews didn't even have a chance to prepare for the trip. That's the whole story of the unleavened bread, what we call the matzah. And the Jews will travel. After a while, the Pharaoh has regrets. And he sends the military, those horses that had been put in the stalls, put in the barns, and not suffered from the diseases. They were hitched up to the chariots, and the Egyptian military went to slaughter the Jews. And we all know the story of the Yam Suf. The Jews escape. The Egyptian military is drowned. These sophisticated weapons, very much like what happened with the great sophisticated Iranian cruise missiles, Iranian ballistic missiles, Iranian UAVs carrying 60 tons of bombs. The same cruise missiles that destroyed the Saudi Arabian oil fields, the same cruise missiles that have shut down international shipping when used by the Houthis, the same cruise missiles that destroyed things in Abu Dhabi. Those cruise missiles, literally, with providential support, and with the support of America, the UK, the Sixth Fleet, and the Central Command, with the support of the incredible miracle of Iron Dome, David Sling, Arrow 2 and Arrow 3. You had a situation where 350 missiles carrying 60 tons of destructive devastation power, in the end, were unable to destroy all the sites, all the strategic sites in Israel that they were meant to destroy. We had a similar situation with what happened with the Egyptian military. And their military drowned, and the Jews survived. The Jews would go on 6 weeks after that to have an encounter where they would engage in a covenant. And that was the goal of their liberation. It wasn't to be free. You know, Martin Luther King quoted when he says, "Let my people go," that's not what Moses did not say, "Let my people go." He says, "Let my people go in order that they will have the ability to engage in a covenant, to serve me, to lead an ethical, moral life as a society, to lead a theological, philosophical life as a society. Society that's rooted in rationality, a society that's rooted in ethical principles." And they go on to create a covenant that we call the Torah. The Torah is the covenant of perfected monotheism, where it's not just an ethical monotheistic covenant, but it's a covenant that they will create a society, a people that leads a life of perfected ethical monotheism. And ultimately, they return to Israel under Moses' chief disciple, Joshua. They conquer the land, they settle the land, and they create that society. And that's the story of the liberation of the Jews. It was not easy. Just like when the Jews, even though we had been living in Israel, from the time the Jews had come under Joshua, there had been a Jewish presence in Israel for 3,400 years. Okay, what I said is wrong. 3,600 years. There had been a Jewish presence in Israel. 3,600 years. Okay? Think about Islam. It was created in the 7th century. Okay? We're talking about 2,200 years before the inception of Islam. Okay? We're talking about 1,500 years before the inception of Christianity. There had been a consistent Jewish presence in the land. And the Jews returned. Many people were threatened. Many people were threatened. And we all know the story of 1948 and 56 and 67. We all know the story of Iran, the Shia Caliphate that is so threatened. We all know the story of the Muslim Brotherhood, of Hamas. And they're not very happy. The Jews who have this unique covenant, who are bound to lead an incredibly perfected ethical, moral life, to create an ethical, moral society, very, very threatening. They're threatening to Iran, to the Supreme Ayatollah, to the Imams, and to the IRGC. They're very threatening to the Muslim Brotherhood, whether it's the Muslim Brotherhood in Turkey, the legal Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, the Hamas. And they were threatening to the great empire of Mitzrayim. And they were threatening to people in their day. But that vision, that dream for humanity, that humanity ultimately fulfills its potential, leading an ethical, a moral, monotheistic lifestyle. That's the story of the Jewish people. It's a story that's been going on for 3,600 years. 3,600 years. And each and every year, Seder night, the Jewish people relive and they re-experience. They don't tell a history lesson. They relive and they re-experience that important, what we'll call their liberation, their independence, their rebirth as a people, their rebirth as a nation. And again, It starts with Moses, the fugitive, returning back to Egypt with their physical liberation, with their psychological liberation a week later when they see that those who enslaved them, their oppressors, their captors, with the great military. That military is destroyed at the Red Sea. And then ultimately their intellectual, their spiritual liberation that takes place 6 weeks after that at Mount Sinai, with the covenant that they create of perfected ethical moral perfection, perfected ethical monotheism, the covenant of the Torah. And then their re-entrance to their homeland, to their nativity, to the land of Israel. That land which is a linchpin between the three great continents, between civilization in Europe, Asia, and Africa, in which they will have a chance to impact all of the international community as they travel through that land. And they build a society that has a ripple effect, south to Africa, northeast and northwest, to Asia Minor, into Europe. And that's the great civilization they create. And that legacy has been a legacy that has existed for the last 3,600 years. Unlike July 4th, unlike Yom Ha'atzmaut, it's not a day of barbecues. It's not a day of boppers. It's not a day of deals at the shopping mall. It's a day where the Jewish people come together and reenact and re-experience that famous Pesach Mitzrayim, the first very Seder that they had, where they studied, they came together and expressed their gratitude to the Almighty for their liberation, for the opportunity to go from being pagan illiterate slaves to becoming ethical monotheistic, educated people, a nation of educated ethical monotheists, which have a responsibility, a huge responsibility, and that is to have an impact on the world, on humanity. And that is the night of the Seder. And that's the story of the Jewish people. We don't just look back. We look back for the purpose of expressing profound gratitude that we were liberated, profound gratitude that we didn't just assimilate amongst the lower castes of civilization, but we were educated, redeemed, we were inspired, we were challenged, and we expressed profound gratitude. And that's why the rabbis chose, the scholars chose, that section that the Jewish farmer would say each and every year after having a successful crop, where they would come to Jerusalem and they would make that declaration. That's the declaration the Jews make the night of the Seder, the night of our birthday, the night of our liberation, the night of our independence, is we celebrate that independence and liberation by committing ourselves to the covenant, by recommitting ourselves each and every year to that holy, to that crucial, to that essential covenant that ultimately shapes us as a people, as a nation, that ultimately inspired us and gave us, under the worst of conditions, the dream, the vision, to return back to our ancestral homeland. Even though a majority at certain times in history of world Jewry were exiles, were refugees, to return back and play that role. And we've been blessed. We've been blessed by God that we live in a time in history where the Jewish people have returned, where we've reestablished the very seat, the very location that the society can be built upon, can live by that covenant, can have an impact on humanity, have an impact on the world community, on civilization, by being an ethical monotheistic people, and by taking responsibility and impacting the world. And despite all the challenges, and despite the threats of annihilation that come from Iran and its 6 proxies, the Jewish people are just as committed and just as passionate as we were on the day of our birth, as we were on the day of our liberation, as we were on the day of our independence. And this year, like each and every year, we re-experience, we relive, and we recreate that great day in Jewish history, the day of our birth, the day of our independence. We tell that story. We relive, re-experience that story, and it's a night of profound gratitude. Gratitude to God, in which we say the Hallel, which we sing Dayenu, in which we tell the story like the Jewish farmer, where we thank God for every step of the way and each stage in our liberation and independence. And I want to wish each and every one of you a meaningful, a powerful Seder, a Seder that's alive, a Seder that you transmit these values to your children and grandchildren. You transmit these values to the next generation. And a night that we also express our gratitude that we've been blessed to live in a stage in Jewish history, where we've returned to our ancestral homeland, where we've ultimately come back and been given the opportunity to relive that dream, to relive that vision as it's alive and well 3,600 years after its initial inception. Thank you, and wishing each and every one of you a Passover of meaning, of thoughtfulness, a Passover of joy, and a Passover where the family grows together. Thank you.